Right, now this here is my new GTX 970, and to me this is new because we've never actually looked at the 970 before. They've held their value really well, but it's only in the last few years where the controversial VRAM configuration has started making people question whether they want one of these, and probably driver support as well, means that prices are now at their rock bottom. And this cost me today £28. And you might be thinking, that seems a bit steep, but this is one of the better ones. I got this on an auction, this seems to be what they're all going for. And also, the GTX 1060 and the RX 580 and 480, the cards that people are probably already commenting about down below, have gone up in price. So that means that the 970 is back. And I've never looked at one, so I am genuinely curious if this is completely obsolete. So let's get this thing open. So what have we got? We've got our graphics card here, look around, but I do believe this is just someone that's actually gone to the effort of properly packaging something with bubble wrap so that it doesn't get damaged. And let's take a little look at what we've got. So we've got some paper and our EVGA, that's right, this is the EVGA one. And what got to me about this was, one, it's one of the brands people want, and two, it still has the protective film on the fans for 28 quid, because people aren't trying to get these at the moment, and it's still got the port covers. And the seller of this did message me and said, "Hi mate, would you be interested in some extras to go with it?" And I'm assuming this is the extras. So we've got included, and people are going to be jealous because I've got RAM for free, 2 mystery sticks of what appear to be DDR3. I don't know the capacity. Oh, 8 gigs. These are 2 8 gig. We got 16 gigs of DDR3 included. So to the guy that shipped this to me, I don't think he knows who I was because I don't tend to disclose that on eBay. This is what he threw in because he didn't want it. So we've got 16 gigs of RAM for free. Thank you. Make sure it does work. I mean, let's be honest, the seller sent us free RAM with it, and it's even got the EVGA SLI covers on there. I don't think those have ever been off. I also need to change my processor over because we don't want to benchmark this with an awful 4-core Athlon. I'm quite optimistic given the condition this is in that it probably will work absolutely fine, but we will double check. Just make sure it does work with the latest drivers. And I mean, I honestly just want to see what the performance is like just out of the box, because I've never used one. I've never had the opportunity to take a look at the 970. I'm curious, I mean, will they overclock? Will this be a good version? And is it actually going to outperform some of the RX cards from AMD? Because they did on launch. I mean, the main competition this has got is the fact that a 980 and a 980 Ti isn't actually much more expensive. Oh, no, it does work. Right, I'll screw this in later, but yeah, we know it does work. I do believe I already have the final drivers, or at least the most up-to-date ones, because Maxwell is only on security updates. But in fact, it did get an update in May, so actually not too long ago. Yes, I do. 582.53 are the latest drivers, and they are from May, so they're only about 3 weeks old. There we are. I believe these are the same ones we ran on the 1030. Which I really don't know what to do with. I now just own a 1030 DDR4. Right, go ahead, install everything, and then while this does this, I'm going to pop out to the shops. So probably no surprise, this did install absolutely fine, and I am using one of the sticks around to point this out, but we've got the GTX 970 based on Maxwell, 28nm, 2014. This is a 12-year-old card, and to be fair, the fact you can still get 30 quid for one of these, not too bad if you're looking at getting rid of one. Drivers are up to date as of this year because Nvidia's support on this line has been absolutely phenomenal, to be fair, and you do get 4 gigs of GDDR5. But the last 512 megabytes run slower, so really it's a 3.5 gig card. I've heard mixed things about it. I've heard some people say it doesn't matter. I've heard other people say that, you know what, it's downright terrible, but the only way we're going to find that out is by testing it ourselves. So we're going to get a baseline score, and honestly, I want to know if these can overclock, because Maxwell, in my experience, has overclocked really nicely. See, one of the reasons why this was beating the AMD Polaris cards back on launch and keeping up quite well with the 1060, even the 6GB version, back in DirectX 11, VRAM didn't matter that much, and to be fair, with it being the prominent API until quite recently, Maxwell's still a lot to give. And despite the fact they are actually really quite competent at DirectX 12 and Vulkan, they are nowhere near on the level of modern Nvidia cards, or just AMD cards of their own era. We're going to try and gauge it just out of the box, and then we'll get a score, find out how good this example actually is, make sure it's not thermally throttling or anything, and then we can go from there. And out of the box, it's looking pretty much where I expected it to be. Slightly worse than an RX 480, which is fair, this is a DirectX 12 benchmark, but to be fair, in simpler scenes, which is probably taking less strain on the VRAM, possibly doing better. We won't know until, of course, the benchmarkers ran and we've got something to compare to and we've overclocked it. Already for 30 quid, this is quite an impressive result. I kind of get why people want the 970. This is looking really, really solid. Right, so it's time to find out how good the 970 is, at least on paper. And that score places it at the top end of GTX 970 hardware out of the box. So it very much lines up with an Intel Meteor Lake, pretty much score for score, but I'm fairly sure we can make some improvements here. We could probably manage about 100 MHz on core, but these already boost quite high from the factory. And the memory, off the top of my head, from Maxwell, you can usually do 300 MHz pretty safe. Okay, and that is looking much happier like that. So what we've done is we've got 300 on the memory, 75 on the core. We'll keep it like that. I'm not too interested in pushing this as far as it can go. For a lot of people that are just buying one of these, because this is an actual budget consideration people keep asking me about. And, I mean, these are clocks that most people should be able to get away with, and our temperature's fine, the card's happy, the blowers aren't even really kicking in. So, yeah, we'll run through TimeSpy again, get some results, and then really, I'm interested in getting it into a game. So we get a few extra points with an overclock. It's not much, but it brings us to just shy of 4,000. I'll see if the memory's happy to go any higher, and then we'll see if it maybe can get us a slightly better score. But, like, you can overclock them, but they tend to work pretty well out of the box, something that only got better with Pascal. And as much as I love AMD's GCN, pretty much anything that's not GCN1, you are tweaking voltages and power limits just to get them to where they should be. Whereas these are very much a plug-and-play experience, and this is just free extra performance for us. I have pushed it up to 400 MHz on the memory. We'll try once more, see what it does, but honestly, I'm quite happy with the score that's getting virtually out of the box. I think this is a pretty fair test to actually find out what the gaming performance is like. I have just set it to default settings. So all I've done, go into settings, click default. I've not even checked what they are, but it looks like it's running in 1080p. And you know what? If a 30 quid card, any 30 quid card can run Cyberpunk with its default settings, then it's not necessarily a bad shout. And it's running at 60 FPS. Yeah, it's just straight up running at 60 FPS. Okay, I mean, it doesn't look bad either. A little bit ghosty. So I'm wondering if it's running FSR of some sort. It's only during fast movement I'm noticing it. Running forward's not a problem, but watching other people walk forward as I run past them does look a little bit ghosty. But, I mean, we're getting 60 FPS. What's it running? A mixture of low and medium settings with a few of the nicer options turned on, and it's also running FSR 2. Right, we'll put it on FSR 3 real quick, because just FSR 3 does look nicer. And it's still running at 60 FPS with FSR 3. And that does sort out a lot of the ghosting. There's no more ghosting going on. It is hilarious how AMD's FSR has just made Maxwell some sort of... AMD's fine wine doesn't so much apply to their cards anymore as much it applies to Nvidia's, because I've just launched up Cyberpunk on a 30 quid 970 and we're getting 60 FPS with its default settings. There's no reason to change how it's running other than at the FSR mode. This is great. I mean, I know the 970 gets a lot of love, but I've never been someone that's been able to test it. But if you're one of those people that bought one, and you know, Cyberpunk comes out, it finally gets fixed, it's had all these updates, and you just click default settings, it looks pretty nice, you're playing at 60 FPS, you can't really get annoyed at it. I mean, I know we're running an overclock, and I mean, we can double check. So if I save my overclock and we just go back to default settings, what's the performance difference? Okay, in real terms, we lost about 3 frames per second. It's still getting about 60 FPS with no overclock. So yeah, the overclock doesn't actually seem to be doing much, I'd imagine because it's just boosting so well out of the box. Yeah, I'm already very impressed. Right, why don't we actually run this through some synthetics, run it through the benchmark suite. I can't imagine this is going to be a very long video. We could do some Linux testing later, but honestly, do we really need to? Maxwell doesn't deal with Linux very well, but we can always take a little look later. But yeah, let's find out how this is doing. So what was the GTX 970? Well, I'm sure most people already know what it is, but this was essentially the go-to card back in 2014. That's right, this is a 12-year-old card, where essentially what you got was a brand new version of the Maxwell architecture, being Maxwell 2.0, and what you ended up with was a card that nearly matched Nvidia's own GTX 980 for significantly less money. Also being part of Maxwell, it was an incredibly efficient architecture compared to Kepler that came before it, And in games of its era, where it's predominantly DirectX 11, this thing was an absolute beast. So think about your games like The Witcher 3, GTA 5, Far Cry 3 and 4, this thing just absolutely dominated in the games people were playing, and left AMD playing catch-up a little bit. Now of course there were AMD cards that competed, like the R9 290X, but even then the Maxwell architecture, as we've even seen on this channel, is just so good that even AMD's top-end card couldn't really compete with the 970 in all DirectX 11 games because it would just deal with them so well, to the stage where if you were pretty much building a budget build for the next few years, you'd either get one of these, or when they entered the used market, well, you just go ahead and get one anyway. For years, this was just the go-to card. Even when the 1060 and the RX 480 from AMD came out, well, these were sort of a go-to option because they were now available on the used market, and for half the money that one of those would cost you new, you could get a 970, and people were still buying them. There was no reason to upgrade from it. The thing is, though, a card this great was not without its controversy. Most of us will have heard that it's not actually a 4GB card, it's actually 3.5, with the last 512 megabytes being slower. This isn't technically true because even I was drawn into this. Everyone was saying, oh, it's just DDR3. Well, no, because it's cut down from the GTX 980, it means that the memory bus can't actually allocate the speeds it needs to that last 512 megabytes, meaning that despite being GDDR5, it does perform like DDR3, which at the time, when most games were using maybe 2.5 gigs of VRAM, 3 gigabytes the maximum unless you were pushing 4K, you don't really notice. So this controversy is mostly something that we're seeing it suffer with today, but then again, we've also just seen the performance earlier, and that was just a brief look at it, and if you're under that VRAM usage, well, it seems to be performing fine. Now, the specifications of the 970 are one of the reasons why it deals with things so well, because AMD forced them to be competitive, so when you look at this as a mid-range card, you have some pretty good specifications on show. It comes out based on the GM204 version of the Maxwell 2.0 architecture, which was a 28nm process, and you have 4GB of GDDR5. That's right, it is a true 4GB, but only the first 3.5GB is actually speedily accessible to the GPU core. You have a 256-bit memory bus, you have up-to-date drivers as of 2026, and we're running the version from May. These are mostly just bug fixes and security rather than optimizations, but hey, fine wine no longer applies to AMD when their cards of this era aren't getting driver updates, but these old Maxwell cards, Nvidia is still supporting. You have 1664 pixel shaders, 56 ROPs, 104 TMUs, and this thing is now 12 years old, being released in 2014. Power consumption is officially from Nvidia around 150 watts, but given this was the era where board partners had a degree of freedom, you will see this change depending on the version you buy. Cost today around £25 to £35, meaning that you're getting a decent chunk of power, but because it's a 970, I still have yet to see these enter true bargain bin territory. £25 seems to be the floor these have gone down to, and you'll see most hovering around this mark. Now, as we've already seen, one of the big things with Maxwell is it is such a good architecture to just use out of the box, something Nvidia would carry on forward with Pascal and then future iterations from there. You don't have to really tweak it around, but if you did want to, these cards do have some overclocking headroom. So the maximum score I was able to get out was 3,963 in Time Spy. I was really trying to break that 4,000 barrier, but given this thing boosts so well out of the box, it didn't really leave me much headroom, so your results will vary depending on what board partner you'll get, but given the architecture is inherently quite good, it's not something you really need to worry about. In terms of a progression through synthetic testing, we see exceptionally good DirectX 10 to DirectX 11 performance, because that's kind of what this card dominates with. Maxwell as an architecture is just phenomenal in DirectX 10 to DirectX 11. And to be fair, in DirectX 12, as we can see here, it's not until we become VRAM limited in Steel Nomad that we see anything detrimental to the performance, although there are indications of it because Steel Nomad Lite returning a lower score than Time Spy does indicate some architectural problems and also VRAM problems, which is likely because that last 512 megabytes is performing slower, so it's already hinting to it in some of those lighter benchmarks. In terms of comparing it to other graphics cards, and we'll start off with 3D Mark's Time Spy because it's quite reminiscent of modern gaming. In terms of performance, we see it somewhere between a
780M and Intel Arc I GPU, and a GTX 1063GB. Pascal is not exactly great with DirectX 12, but does deal with it better than Maxwell. But it finds itself firmly in the middle of the graph, which is exactly where I'd expect a mid-range graphics card to place itself. In terms of Firestrike, I've had to add a couple more graphics cards into this because I really wanted to show off just how good this card was, and it is only losing out to the RX 580. And that's because that is something that AMD really optimized into by shoving tons of voltage into it to try and boost up scores like this. But other than that card, it nearly takes the top spot, even beating out a 1060. That's how good these cards were. The only case where we see it fall down completely is in Steel Nomad, where it is finding itself along with all the other 4GB cards just right at the bottom of the graph. It just baselines itself at around 3 FPS and can't do much more with it, to the stage where even a 750 Ti or one of these just ends up performing the exact same. The only 4GB card that does better was the Fury, and that's because it's got HBM. So yeah, in modern titles, already the synthetics are showing that we could end up struggling. Now, as for the benchmarking today, I will repeat it because a lot of people don't check the description. We are running with a Ryzen 7 3700X, we are running with 32GB of DDR4 RAM at 3200MHz, and the only bottleneck in the system is the GTX 970. Now, in terms of benchmarking today, we are just going to be using the benchmark suite. This isn't a retro card, despite being 12 years old. This is something that people continuously ask me about because they are looking at buying one. I know for some of us over here in the West, there are better options available, but even then, when you are looking at the UK, the US and the European market, we are now seeing that because everything's got to go up in price, the RX 580 and the 1060 and all those cards that people were saying just get one of those are now going up in price. Meaning that the 970 now finds itself in a weird situation where once again it is the sort of forgotten mid-range card that is now being thrust back into the limelight because people haven't got to them yet. So the main way we want to test this is to find out how does it actually deal with the modern world. Because let's be honest, if you want to go back and see how it deals with Far Cry 3 and Far Cry 4 and other legacy titles, you can just load up a review of the era and you'll find all of the results you need. What we actually want to find out today is how does a GTX 970, a rather competent looking card, actually deal with the modern world in the benchmarks. Now, starting off the benchmarks, we have the latest release of GTA 5 with the Enhanced Edition. Now, the game defaulted to very high, but unfortunately our frame times were a little bit of a mess with these settings, so I opted to turn textures down to normal, which did help resolve some of the stuttering, because that last 512 megabytes, it's not a problem until you just about touch it, and then suddenly, yes, you do notice it in terms of the frame times, and it can be a little bit unpleasant, but provided you don't mind normal textures, the 970 started off really strong with 62 FPS on average, and 1% lows down to 51 FPS. It's worth noting that grass, particularly because it was turned up to very high, did actually bring us down to 50, well, around high 40s to mid 50s in terms of frame rate, which would quickly disappear after you've been in it long enough, but it was enough to notice and is something that does happen on 970 cards. I remember it happening back in the Legacy release, but still here it does deal with DirectX 12 rather well, and moving over into the world of online, we saw that things were pretty much the exact same. Our average did go down given this was a busy lobby with lots of explosions happening, mostly myself, and we returned 54 FPS on average and 1% lows down to 43 FPS. This is likely because, well, it's more VRAM intensive despite not being as heavy on the graphics card, so our utilization did go down a little bit, which isn't something we often see in the Enhanced Edition, but overall still a very playable experience. Our one legacy test of the day is of course GTA 5 Legacy, as a good place for people to sort of gauge how good the card was back in the day, and also because it's still a very popular title out on Steam. We return an average of 67 FPS, with 1% lows down to 58 FPS with the game set to very high across the board, which is exactly what it defaults to because the GTX 970 is sort of exactly what this game was targeting to be able to run this game at high settings in 1080p back when it launched in 2015, so makes sense that a 2014 mid-range card is sort of what this was designed to run on, with a perfectly smooth 60 FPS experience. Honestly, there's not really much to say. It looked great, it ran great. It's GTA 5 Legacy running on a GTX 970. What is more interesting though is the world of online, which has become a bit of a bloated mess, especially over 16 players, and our VRAM utilization skyrocketed and our GPU utilization went down. And as you can tell by the frame times, this is exactly what happens on a 970 when you go over those 3.5 gigabytes. Now you could resolve this by dropping settings, or just doing the more sane thing and moving over to the enhanced edition of GTA Online. This legacy version, they've left it in a state where it's still playable, but it does run pretty badly these days. I mean, look at that frame times in the top left. It's not exactly great. It was playable, it was controllable, but it wasn't exactly as good as the enhanced edition could be. For a lot of people looking at the GTX 970, they'll be looking at those easier to run games like Counter-Strike 2, and to be fair, they do run really well on a 970, mostly because the equivalent AMD cards of the era take a bit of a while for the stuttering to stop. I usually have to do a couple of runs of the benchmark map just before the stuttering goes away, and then it's gone until I change graphics card again. On these Nvidia cards, they work fine out of the box, other than the fact you can't go into full screen, you have to use borderless full screen for a 1080p resolution. Don't ask me why, it just seems to be the case with the Nvidia drivers. But we did return 182 FPS on average, with 1% lows down to 156 FPS, which is already a very competitive experience in a full HD resolution. For a lot of people though that will be running 1280 by 960, which seems to be the way people are playing the game these days, our average went up to 228 FPS, with 1% lows actually getting better, up to 194 FPS. Which makes sense, we're using less VRAM, we're using less resolution, and the 970 deals with DirectX 11, which this title uses, very well. In terms of an actual modern experience that may actually put some more load on the card, the latest release of Cache is one of the more intensive maps out there. It's nearly the most intensive map actually available in CS2. So how does it deal with it? Well, utilising these same settings, we returned 146 FPS on average, with 1% lows down to 93 FPS, which to me felt perfectly smooth. No, it's not exactly the peak of competitive gameplay, but at the same time, for a graphics card you can pick up for around 25 quid, it's a pretty good time. So Counter-Strike 2, even in the most intensive of scenarios, is still going to average just shy of 150 frames per second, which is a good showing for a cheap and 12-year-old card. Next up, we have the very popular and probably the most optimised Unreal Engine 5 title there is out there, with Arc Raiders. Now, we ran the game with a mixture of low and medium settings, so mostly things like view distance, texture size, bits and pieces like that turned down to low, and a lot of the effects turned up to medium, so your shadows, your particle effects, bits and pieces like that, they were up to medium settings because they had very little to no impact on the graphics card. And this is what I mean when AMD's fine wine now applies to Nvidia, because this was a perfect experience, and we were using AMD's FSR3, which was set to balance mode and how the game defaulted to actually get the game running properly. Well, it would run fine without anti-aliasing or any upscaling at all, but seeing as it defaults to FSR on these cards, I left it in place. And to be fair, it is a very good implementation in Arc Raiders that doesn't look smeary or ghosty or anything like that. It's just a better looking experience. And how does it run? 64 FPS on average, with 1% lows down to 51 FPS. There was no VRAM problems, there was no stuttering issues, there was no frame time problems, and at the same time, if there are, Arc Raiders has a very good way of dealing with these things where it will simply just reduce the level of detail on close-up objects. We've seen it on lower-end cards where trees just won't load in, but at least you keep a playable and smooth frame rate. Not that that was really a problem here, because the game actually looked pretty good and ran at 60 FPS on a GTX 970. Which is just absolute insanity to me. On the other end of the Unreal Engine 5 spectrum is Oblivion Remastered, still a very popular title given it is actually quite a fun remaster of Oblivion, but most people would assume there is no way to get it running on a 970. Once again, we only really have 3.5 gigabytes of VRAM because that last 512 megabytes is very slow, but there's no way of getting around that here. But there is sort of a way of getting around it. We can just cap the frame rate externally with MSI Afterburner, so we had it capped to 30 FPS with low settings plus FXAA in 540p. And it ran fine. I mean, it was a 30 FPS experience in under 720p, but it was in fact running, and it was controllable and there wasn't much stutter. So Oblivion Remastered, I went into this expecting it to not work, and to be fair, it took a long time to load. And I'd imagine that is due to the VRAM configuration, but to be fair, provided you didn't mind spending 5 minutes to actually get in game, you can actually play Oblivion Remastered on a GTX 970, which is one of the... I thought this was going to be sort of the turning point of it won't run, because it's a modern title that's not particularly well optimised on an engine that just demands VRAM. But to be fair, It ran okay, it doesn't look too bad. You can't use FSR or any upscaling here because, well, there's no VRAM left over and the implementation in Oblivion Remastered is pretty poor, to be honest, with loads of ghosting. But yeah, 30 FPS experience in 540p, as long as you don't mind that, the 970 will in fact do it. But given it did somehow manage Oblivion Remastered, I suppose we need to find something even more intensive to say, no, this is the limit of the card. So I loaded up Samson, which, to be fair, I completed. It's a fun enough game, and for what they charge for it, I mean, £17, I had my fun with it. But there's no denying it is pretty terribly optimised. But it does at least launch on a GTX 970, something that equivalent Polaris cards, which aren't even really equivalent, they are modern cards, can't actually do. I made a custom low config to try and remove most of the effects and actually optimise the textures as much as possible, but this really goes to show that this is it draws in on the endpoint of the 970. These games that you just can't bring under 4GB of VRAM usage, and they just won't run properly. In 720p with TAA, which was the least intensive option I could find, we returned 27 FPS on average, with 1% lows down to 17 FPS. Very indicative of the memory configuration, but also just the lack of optimization in this title. Don't get me wrong, simpler areas would run at a locked 30 FPS and the game looked downright hideous, but the moment anything was actually happening, or you were actually trying to play the game, it would be anywhere from sort of 20 to 25 FPS, sometimes higher than this. So yeah, modern Unreal Engine 5, I don't want to call it slop because I quite enjoyed the game, but in terms of optimization, it is a very sloppy experience. So yeah, this is kind of where the 970 meets its match. Unreal Engine 5 games that haven't had any optimizations. In more positive news, for games that aren't using Unreal Engine 5, like Cyberpunk 2077, we ran with the same settings we saw earlier, which was a mixture of low and medium, with FSR 3 set to balance mode in 1080p. You could of course just lower the resolution down to somewhere like 720p or 900p if you didn't want to use FSR, but to be fair, once again, Cyberpunk does make good use of the technology without the smearing or ghosting that is apparent in some other titles. And can you really be annoyed at it, because these are pretty much the out-of-box settings, other than changing FSR to a newer version, and we returned 63 FPS on average, with 1% lows down to 49 FPS. Honestly, if I was playing through this game, I'd probably play it at a locked 30 FPS with some of the other less VRAM intensive options turned up to, I don't know, say like medium or high, and just get away with playing it that way. But at the same time, even with an uncapped frame rate, this did feel particularly smooth. Those 1% low figures are mostly from when I was causing as much chaos as possible to try and see what a worst case scenario on the card would look like. And it still plays it at more or less 50 to 60 frames per second. So Cyberpunk 2077, I would have no problems or issues playing it on a 12-year-old GTX 970. It also goes to show that Maxwell, despite people saying, oh, it can't deal with DirectX 12 very well, in certain titles, it actually does deal with it particularly fantastically. Next up we have BeamNG, which of course is a very popular title people love seeing tested, and I've been told by someone apparently this is getting a DirectX 12 update soon, which will be interesting to see tested, but as it stands at the moment this still runs on DirectX 11, which means it should be absolutely fine for our little 970. Now with medium and high settings, with the traffic enabled on the jungle map, which is pretty much a recipe for disaster on weaker end cards, we saw no problems, because this card just deals with DirectX 11 that well. There's no problems, there was no issues with the VRAM, there was no issues with frame times. BeamNG was pretty much a fantastic experience, to the stage where, if this is what it's going to run like in a more intensive scenario, as you can imagine, these simpler maps like the cliff, the hill, bits and pieces like that, will run in excess of 60 frames per second with ease. So, if you want to play BeamNG and these simpler titles that still run on DirectX 11, I don't really want to call this a simple title because it's had a lot of updates and is quite complex these days. It runs perfectly fine with 60 frames per second, which is nice to see on a 970, given lots of people will tell you that you'll run into VRAM problems when, even with this setup, we just genuinely didn't. The one major advantage we have of testing with an Nvidia card is it gives us reason to actually test Baldurs Gate 3, because it doesn't work well on any of the equivalent AMD cards of this era, because Vulkan just doesn't work, so it means that on these Nvidia cards, which deal with DirectX 11 really well, it'll default itself to high and ultra settings in 1080p, and return 46 FPS on average, with 1% lows down to 34 FPS. And honestly, there's no real problems here. This is just how the game defaults itself, and it runs well on a GTX 970. It's nice to know that Baldurs Gate 3 can actually run well. It's just a shame that, well, not a shame if you're looking at buying a GTX 970, but this single-handedly beats most AMD Polaris cards, which can't really run the game well on Windows. I've heard better things over on Linux, but now I'm going on a tangent. So if you are looking at playing games like this, well, the 970 beats out not just lots of other cards of its era, it beats out pretty much most newer AMD cards that just can't run this game very well at all, at least not with a stable frame rate. People always love seeing Fortnite tested because it's still a very popular title, and lots of people that will be looking at this card will probably be looking at building a PC for their kids or some family members that are pretty much going to sit there and just play Fortnite and all these other competitive games, and they're going to want to know how it performs because they're going to be chasing them frame rates, I'm sure they are, but it turns out you can in fact do that on a GTX 970. I went with performance mode in DirectX 12, which is pretty much all the low settings, which apparently is hip with the kids, and that's what they're using to be able to see what they're aiming at. No one uses high settings in this game, they just want the highest frame rate they can with the lowest settings possible. And we returned 172 FPS on average, with 1% lows down to 144 FPS. So pretty much no problems here in Fortnite. It's a very competitive experience. I'm not very good at the game, but it did feel very smooth. If you really were adamant about having the smoothest experience, I'd just cap it at 144 FPS, because then your average is going to match your 1% lows and it would pretty much just be completely solid. So yeah, Fortnite, absolutely no problems. You can run it uncapped and get 172, or you can run it capped and get a locked 144. It's your choice, but it runs well. For other Battle Royale games, the popular one is PUBG, still very popular these days, and fortunately you can select the DirectX 11.1 renderer option, which is DirectX 11 Enhanced in the options menu, and with a mixture of low and medium settings, so a similar vein to all the others, low textures but medium effects, we saw the game return a very, very playable 112 FPS on average, with very smooth frame times down to 93 FPS. It must be said in PUBG, if you're using something AMD, DirectX 12 tends to be better, but if you're using something Nvidia, DirectX 11.1 is really what you should be aiming to use. And given DirectX 11.1 is less VRAM heavy, it means that even on this 4GB card, where only 3.5GB actually speedy, you don't really run into any problems. I mean, this is a very smooth frame rate, these are very smooth frame times, and given the notorious issues PUBG has, I'm going to take 100 FPS on average as a bit of a win here. You could turn some of the settings up, but in a similar vein to Fortnite, people just want to play this with most things turned down to low and the highest frame rate possible, but Maxwell, I have to give it credit as an architecture, does seem to play PUBG better than virtually all other cards we test. One of the most beautifully optimized titles of recent years with M&B Bannerlord, which defaulted to very high settings in 1080p. It did turn down the texture streaming budget down to medium, probably because they have a config for this card. I don't know how they do it, but it always chooses pretty much settings that will get you in and around 60 FPS, and on weaker end hardware, just playable frame rates. So they must have a config for every card, but the 970, they know what they're doing out of the box. 62 FPS on average, 1% lows down to 48 FPS through the built-in benchmark, and this was with the battle size set up to high, and it was absolutely fine. There was a few stutters in places, but then again, these would quickly go away. So M&B Bannerlord, given this benchmark, is very reminiscent of the late game. You're looking at anywhere pretty much north of 100 frames per second in the early game, similar frame rates in the mid game, and in the late game you're still going to be seeing 60 frames per second. So Bannerlord, no problems on a GTX 970. When it comes to the games with the worst settings menu in the world, it's Red Dead Redemption 2, because I couldn't actually turn up the resolution. Because of how the game defaults itself, we were stuck with very high and ultra settings, which pretty much used up all 4GB of VRAM, somehow not actually going over that 3.5GB mark most of the time, because the VRAM slider in this game is a complete and utter lie. Yet it will not let you change settings around unless it says, oh, you've got enough memory for that, which leads to these fun situations where, really, I'd configure this game around a little bit and get it running in 1080p, but instead we're just running with the out-of-box optimized Nvidia settings, which is very high and ultra in 900p. So like a very pretty looking version of like the PlayStation 4 or Xbox One, probably better than both of those to be honest, and we returned 41 FPS on average, with 1% lows down to 34. Really, what I would say with this game is to try and go into the config, force it up to 1080p, lock the frame rate externally to 30 FPS, and that'd be the best way of playing it, or do the opposite and move the settings lower, which you also can't do with the VRAM set as the way it is in this game. But still, Red Dead Redemption 2, I'm going to stop complaining about the settings menu and just say it runs perfectly fine, just you're going to be in that settings menu if you want to change the settings around. Next up, with a brand new title, that's right, this game came out a week ago, 2 weeks ago, and is already proving to be very popular. We have Paralives, which we ran with medium settings and low textures and 1080p, and it certainly had a few quirks on the 970. Likely because this is a brand new title out, there are probably no optimizations done on the driver's side, which would make sense, this is an indie title, but we did return 36 FPS on average, with 1% lows down to 15 FPS, which was playable here. I will say I had no problems getting around, but the main issue was, as you loaded in more and more buildings and lots, the issue is you'd fill up the VRAM pool and those busy areas would have, the spikes in the frame rate. If you were just, playing the game, going from your house to work and bits and pieces like that with a few people there, no problems, it would run at about 30 to 40 FPS, but as you start saturating that VRAM pool, the stuttering would start, which would also become worse as you sped up the game. I did monitor CPU side usage, but it wasn't the Ryzen 7 that was having any problems here, it was down to the 970. This might be fixed in future updates, but then again, my main takeaway here is, if you bought one of these 12 years ago, bought a brand new title that came out 2 weeks ago, you are still playing it without even dropping to the lowest settings at above 30 FPS, which is pretty good going. Given that we've seen Fallout 4's anniversary update has really changed around how performance works, especially on these older cards, and really has optimized it on newer cards, it is interesting to go back to just to see how a 970 is faring, because back in the day, if you were playing Fallout 4, the 970 pretty much offered a perfectly passable experience, with high and ultra settings. So if you're now running the game with ultra settings in 1080p, which is how the game defaults, it's running okay with the anniversary edition. It is certainly more VRAM heavy than it used to be, which did lead to some quite wonky frame times when lots had loaded in, but generally even in these intensive areas, you'll be seeing 49 FPS on average, with 1% lows down to 39 FPS. When you're outside in the wilderness, when you're inside buildings, when you're in simpler scenarios, the game was pretty much a locked 60 FPS, which was nice to see, but given the anniversary update does become more VRAM intensive, it does mean those intensive areas also will have more an effect on the card, bringing you down from anywhere from sort of 40 to 50 FPS. I'm not really going to criticize it too much because it felt perfectly playable to me, and I can't really complain because this is the anniversary update and it has fixed a lot of newer cards, but here I'd probably recommend dropping back to high settings. It still won't be a locked 60 FPS, but it will be closer to it. But finally, can it run Crysis Remastered? Now, I was particularly cruel here, running the game with high settings in 1080p, but I thought, you know what, if with this, we're probably not going to be looking at the GTX 970, at least not for years from now. So how is it actually doing with, one of the more intensive titles out there when turned right up to high settings? And I thought, let's just find out. And it ran at 37 FPS on average, with 1% lows down to 28 FPS, which was a little bit wonky in places, and it was mostly the geometry of vehicles that was causing problems. Now, you could turn a few things like object detail down to medium, or just turn the entire game down to medium, you'll pretty much be seeing near 60 FPS. But it does highlight the architectural problem of the 970, especially looking at that car really well. You go from a game that is running at pretty much 30 to 40 FPS on average, down to around 10 to 15, because we've saturated that VRAM pool by, in this case, just looking through the window of a car in a weird way. I don't know what it's doing there, but I've never seen that happen, but it does happen here on the 970, and I think it's a really good way of demonstrating the issues with that last 512 megabytes of VRAM. It just goes to it just stunts performance, it almost flatlines, in a way that doesn't normally happen on a regular card if you just, say, ran out of VRAM. So Crysis Remastered, it runs, but it also highlights what will be the 970's downfall. As more and more games start to go over that buffer, you just end up with a performance just tanks, and that's gonna be the way it is. So, overall performance of the GTX 970 in 2026, and to be fair, I can't really see all too many problems with it, because it's just about hanging in there. And it is the VRAM that's the problem. When it comes to the actual power of the card, and even the drivers, well, there's not really any issues. In fact, in terms of an out-of-the-box experience, it is better than, well, a lot of the equivalent AMD cards you'd think of, the RX 470, 480, 580, pretty much all the Polaris cards around that sort of power tier. Well, the out-of-the-box experience is still better on a GTX 970, and a lot of that just comes down to the fact that these are set up really well. As an architecture, it boosts up pretty high, and a lot of games, well, the drivers will auto-configure themselves for you settings-wise, and usually get it pretty spot on. I mean, Red Dead Redemption 2 is a great example, where I just let the drivers choose the settings because that settings menu is just a pain in the arse to deal with when you haven't got much VRAM, which of course we don't. In terms of actual longevity, though, we are seeing that its main match in terms of 2026 gaming is Unreal Engine 5 slop. And I'm not calling Samson slop as a game, but in terms of optimization, I mean, let's be honest, the visuals on display do not need a GTX 970. It can run Crysis at high settings within reason, Crysis Remastered that is, but can't manage Samson at low settings with a custom configuration to actually try and eke back as much performance as we can. So it's a bit of a weird one because, I mean, for the vast majority of people, the benchmark selection is taken from the top played games, the games people are actively playing. And it's fine. For 25 to 35 quid, you can pretty much play everything you'd want to play. Cyberpunk, not a problem. GTA 5, also not a problem. Counter-Strike 2 is a decently competitive experience, even in the newer and more intensive maps. And you go into some of the easier to run Unreal Engine 5 titles, and Arc Raiders, pretty much a 60 FPS experience, up there with Cyberpunk. So it really has blown me away that the 970 is this good as a card, and is something that is easily available. All I did to buy this one was I thought, I've never looked at the 970 before, go onto eBay, type GTX 970, followed an auction, and I've got one that I haven't got to clean it, it's still got the original seals on it, it doesn't overheat, it just works really well, but it is certainly feeling its age when you start getting into those newer titles that, well, it could run, but unfortunately due to the world of optimizations where it just lacks them these days, it's just not going to. So for the performance you're actually getting, how easy of a card is this to run? Because when it comes to these older cards, especially ones on older architectures and older processors, power consumption and thermals are something people like to take into consideration. And for this EVGA version, which does come overclocked out of the box, most versions you come across will tend to run an overclock or a boost unless they're a very low-end version, in which case you can still manually overclock them up quite a bit. And power consumption-wise, it can use a decent chunk of power. Under a full stress test when overclocked, we saw peaks of 173 watts. When you're gaming, it's just north of 161. To be fair, at stock settings, it is around 150, so around the quoted figure from Nvidia. Media work brings it down to 40-ish watts, which is not great exactly. I thought it'd use less power, but these were power-hungry cards at desktop usage. I mean, it's just one of the things that was happening with the architecture. And at idle, still surprisingly high. I'm not too sure why, but maybe it's the EVGA BIOS. We saw 26 watts as stock and 32 watts with the overclock applied, which, to be fair, you could just get rid of. When it comes to the temperatures, this is taken from the hot spot, so the hottest part of the graphics card. Keep in mind I've not cleaned this card, so you could likely improve this if you cleaned the card and gave it new thermal paste, but to be fair, we weren't having any throttling, and we saw around 88 degrees when fully stress tested and overclocked, which isn't actually too bad, down to 72 degrees while gaming, around the mid-40s while doing desktop and media work, and around the low, well, not really low 40s, but high 30s when it was at idle, and this is when it pretty much turns the fans off. So there was like no noise coming from this whatsoever. So in terms of actual thermals and power consumption, nothing crazy. You'd really need a decent 350 watt or a good 400 watt power supply to run one of these in a budget build. So yeah, they are obtainable and you don't have to spend too much on the power supply, but it is worth keeping in mind that no, you can't just whack these in a Dell Optiplex with a 250 watt power supply. That really is a terrible idea. What else is there really to say? I mean, despite being a very solid out-of-the-box experience, there are some issues with drivers, nothing that will surprise anyone too much if they've used this era of cards, but really the best way of getting drivers on here is to roll back to an older version when you initially install them, so you can keep the older Nvidia app where all functionality is retained, because it's very hit or miss whether some of the features you might want to use like the Nvidia overlay and shadow play will work through the newer Nvidia app. You really need the older utilities program that came out a year ago, 2 years ago. Either way, just download an older driver version and then update from there to keep the app, and that will fix a lot of these driver issues, because if you're using the latest version out of the box from Nvidia, the overlay, I could not get it to work. I tried dabbling around with it loads, and in terms of actual gaming issues, there's only one that I can really name, which is the original Crysis, which will only launch in DirectX 9 mode, and because of this you will also run into shader errors. This is an issue on pretty much all new AMD cards which have poor performance, all Intel cards which hardly run it, and the latest Nvidia cards which can't actually launch it in DirectX 10 mode, but can run it in DirectX 9 with, of course, shader errors. So if you are doing some retro gaming, it might be worth rolling back to an older driver version. There'll be lesser driver overheads. I mean, not really, these drivers aren't crazy intensive given the age of the graphics card, but these are things that are worth considering. Other than that, though, I mean, it's a really good experience out of the box. The drivers are good, they'll optimize your games. In terms of actually giving this to someone for a simple out-of-the-box experience, they're still going to get updates, and if they don't know what a settings menu is, the Nvidia app will just pick settings for them that they're not going to have any problems with, and then they can just drag a slider if they want 60 FPS, or drag the slider if they want better graphics. It's as simple as that. Your NVENC works, it's nothing amazing, it's the same as a GTX 750, and that's really all there is to say that is like extra features on a GTX 970. It's not exactly amazing when it comes to features, but a lot of them will work as long as you use an older version of the drivers and update rather than going straight into it with the Nvidia app. So there we have it, Nvidia's GTX 970 finally featured on budget builds. Genuinely, I really thought we would have looked at this by now, but it's only reached this point now everyone's forgotten about them, that they're now finding a bit of a budget resurgence because, while everything else is going up in price, Maxwell seems to have become oddly very cheap. And that's part of one of the only issues why I'm struggling to give this a full recommendation. Because for about £5 more than this, if that, you can pick up a full GTX 980. In fact, I've gone ahead and picked up a GTX 980 for less than £2 more than this cost me. So we'll likely be looking at that in the future. And for not much more than that, you can then have the full-fat 980 Ti, which was honestly probably one of my favourite cards we've tested this year. It was just an absolute beast. It's got the VRAM, it's got the power, it's got the drivers, it supports DirectX 12, and it's just such a great budget option. And that's really the problem with the 970. I mean, you compare it against the RX 580 and the RX 480 and the GTX 1060, which have all gone up in price, and you go, you know what, maybe this isn't a bad shout. But you compare it against the other Maxwell options, which people have also forgotten about, and suddenly it's like, well, what if I just spend a little bit more and I get a 980 Ti? Or what if I spend literally a fraction more and get a full 980? The GTX 970 is not a bad card, and if you are just looking for something to stick in a PC and game, more power to you. You can get these very cheap and very commonly, and that's one of the things they have going for them. They sold so many of these, they are very easy to find. But at the same time, if you don't mind looking around a little bit, there are better options from the same graphics generation. So anyway, I hope you've all found this review interesting. I personally have been blown away, and despite the fact me saying there's better options, the fact that the mid-range 970 is this good 12 years later, you know, people keep saying AMD fine wine, but GCN driver updates are over. Even Polaris driver updates are pretty much over these days. And then you end up with Maxwell, where this thing has received solid driver updates from Nvidia for 12 years now, to the stage where new games will launch with no problems, and the drivers, they have their faults, but they will still work. So fine wine isn't so much an AMD thing anymore, it is reserved pretty much for me, for Maxwell, because I wasn't expecting this level of performance, I wasn't expecting this ease of use, and yeah, sure, you got 512 megabytes of slowly accessible VRAM. How often did that become a problem? Not as much as I bet you thought it would, because I was surprised. Anyway, thank you all very much for watching. I've had a great time testing this. There's probably no point doing a Linux segment because it's Maxwell and it doesn't do great. But if you're a Windows user, this is a very solid option. So anyway, hope you all enjoyed. Thank you very much for watching, and good night.